Welcome to Nero Secrets. I'm your host, Jimmy, and today's mystery is a chilling one. Hercule Poirot and the open door in photography. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more mystery stories. Chapter 1. The Disturbing Portrait. Lady Margaret Wrexham was used to the little dramas that accompanied any event in her vast and proud home, Wrexham Hall. However, as she gazed through the amber light of the drawing-room, her half-finished glass of sherry trembling slightly in her hand, Lady Margaret felt an unusual unease. In the corner of the room, framed with golden pretensions, hung the last photograph of the family, an image of them all gathered to celebrate Lord Wrexham's 70th birthday. A carefully choreographed scene. And yet, now that he looked at it again, there was something strange, something profoundly wrong. The rear door, a heavy oak door, leading to the north gallery, appeared ajar in the photograph, although Lady Margaret clearly remembered closing it that morning, and it wasn't an accidental opening. A barely perceptible shadow could be seen on the threshold. A shiver ran down his spine. It was at that moment that the maid, nervous and trembling, burst into the room. "My lady!" he gasped, his eyes wild. "It's Lord Wrexham! He's dead!" The cup fell from Lady Margaret's hand, crashing to the floor. Northumberland police arrived within minutes. They found Lord Wrexham slumped in his personal library, a room adjacent to the North Gallery. He died, apparently, of natural causes. Heart failure, they concluded hastily. But there were details that didn't add up. The window was ajar despite the rain. A vase had been knocked off its pedestal, and the key to his desk, a desk that held documents of considerable sensitivity, had disappeared. Inspector Cattermole, a large man with a ruddy face, murmured to his assistant, "Knowing these people, someone surely knows more than they admit," and asked everyone present to remain at Wrexham Hall until further notice. It was Lady Margaret, still pale but resolute, who proposed a more refined solution. "There is someone who could see what you can't." "Who?" Cattermole asked sceptically. "A Belgian gentleman of worldwide reputation. A master in matters of the human mind and heart. His name is Hercule Poirot." Poirot arrived at Wrexham Hall 2 days later, in a shiny black car, perfectly punctual and perfectly warm against the bitter cold. He climbed out with measured grace, adjusting his gloves with a slight sigh of disapproval at the mud that splattered the driveway. He was welcomed into the great hall, where portraits of generations of Wrexham regarded him with stern, distant faces. Lady Margaret bowed slightly in respect. "Monsieur Poirot, thank you for coming at such short notice." Poirot bowed ceremoniously. "Madame, when a man's life has been extinguished under suspicious circumstances," he bowed his head gravely, "the little grey cells cannot afford to rest." The hostess led him to the living room, where the other members of the house were waiting. Edward Wrexham, the eldest son, a businessman who appeared calm, but whose nervous eyes revealed something else. Clarissa Wrexham, his wife, beautiful, icy, and too perfect. Henry Wrexham, the second son, bohemian and cheeky, with a faint smell of whisky. Beatrice Vane, the orphaned niece, with a reserved look and tight lips. Reverend Samuel Pritchard, the family chaplain, with a kind expression and trembling hands. Miss Helena Brooks, the governess, a woman thin as a whip, with a stern face. Each greeted Poirot with a mixture of expectation and distrust. Poirot, after a brief moment of silent assessment, turned to Lady Margaret. "Madame," he said softly, before continuing, "could you show me the photograph that disturbs you so much?" In front of the crackling fireplace, Lady Margaret handed him the portrait. Poirot took it with extreme delicacy, as if handling a fragile piece of evidence. He looked at each face, the tight smiles, the careful postures. Then his eyes slid to the back of the image, towards the half-open door and the insinuating shadow. "Curieux," he murmured. Using his pocket magnifying glass, he examined the edges of the door in the photograph. A small look of satisfaction crossed his face. "Gentlemen, ladies," he announced, turning to the group, "let me assure you, this is not a case of natural death. And even more, the key to unravelling the mystery is already here, in front of us, in this simple image." His words fell like a stone into the frozen pond of the living room. Poirot put the photograph on the table and clasped his hands. "Now, if you would be so kind, I would like to start asking some questions. And my God, I pray that you all be—" His moustache trembled slightly. "Be very, very precise in your answers." And so, the game of shadows, half-truths, and small involuntary gestures began under the penetrating gaze of Hercule Poirot. Chapter 2. A House of Secrets. Poirot settled into a green velvet armchair, delicately crossing one leg over the other. On the low table in front of him, the photograph lay like a silent warning, its enigmatic door open, defying reason. With a gentle gesture of his hand, he signalled for the interviews to begin. "Allow me to get to know you a little more, mes amis," he said with a polite smile, although his eyes, sharp as scalpels, did not miss a single nuance of his expressions. Lady Margaret was the first to speak, more out of hostess instinct than desire. "My husband was—" She paused as if words were difficult for her. "Worried lately. He mentioned financial matters. He feared for the future of the property." Poirot nodded slowly. "And you, madame, were you aware of any important documents kept in your private desk?" Lady Margaret frowned. "I know he had papers related to investments and other things of a sensitive nature, but I was not allowed to interfere." Poirot tilted his head slightly, storing up the information. Then his gaze slid to Edward Wrexham. "Monsieur Edward, where were you at the time of your father's death?" Edward straightened his back. "In the greenhouse. The storm damaged some plants, and I went to inspect. My wife can confirm it," he added quickly, casting a glance toward Clarissa. She smiled, cold and controlled. "That's right," he said, with a voice so soft it barely broke the air. Poirot made a mental note of the overly synchronized response. He then turned to Henry, the second son, who was drumming his fingers against the back of a chair. "And you, monsieur?" Henry shrugged. "I was in the cellar. I was making sure the wine supply survived the storm." A response that caused Poirot to smile, although his eyes did not leave Henry's face. The smell of alcohol was evident, but so was something else, a tinge of defiance, of poorly concealed contempt. Beatrice, the niece, was next. He sat rigidly, hands clasped in his lap. "I was in the library, but in the literature section I didn't see anyone." His words were accompanied by a nervous rigidity, as if each word was carefully measured before coming out. Reverend Pritchard, for his part, seemed uncomfortable, even sitting down. I was in the private chapel, praying for the health of Lord Wrexham." Her voice trembled, and Poirot could not help but notice the way she twisted her hands in her lap. Finally, Miss Helena Brooks, the governess, spoke in a sharp voice. "In my room, correcting Beatrice's exercises." He didn't add more, as if any attempt at further conversation was a waste of time. Poirot nodded again, satisfied with the first round of statements. I didn't expect the truth to emerge immediately. No, these were just the first pieces, the first flashes of contradiction. "Merci. Very instructive, he said, as he stood up with an elegant movement. He walked slowly toward the photograph, and his fingers, clad in immaculate gloves, caressed the edge of the frame. "This image," he murmured, "contains more than it seems. Not just because of the door, but because of what it says about you. The positions, the gestures, the angle of the glances, everything speaks, everything reveals, those present exchanged uneasy glances. The atmosphere, already charged, seemed to thicken. Lady Margaret, in a barely audible voice, asked, "Do you believe, Monsieur Poirot, that one of us—" Poirot did not respond immediately. He turned to her with kindness, but also with a seriousness that brooked no evasion. "Madame," he said softly, "the deepest betrayal can only come from those who are admitted among us." A flash of lightning illuminated the stained-glass windows, casting fleeting shadows on the tense faces. Poirot let the silence stretch for a few more moments before speaking again. "Early tomorrow I will conduct more detailed interviews in private, and also, if you will allow me, I wish to examine the North Gallery, the library, and—" his voice lowered slightly, "the private chapel." Inspector Catamole, who had remained in the corner like a watchdog, growled in approval. "I'll have someone accompany you." Poirot shook his head gently. "It will not be necessary, monsieur. There are things that must be observed without the shadow of other eyes." He bowed once more to those gathered. "Good evening, gentlemen, ladies. I advise you to rest. Tomorrow, every word, every small gesture, will weigh more than you imagine." With light but firm steps, Poirot left the room, leaving behind him a group immersed in silent anxiety. The photograph, abandoned on the table, seemed to observe them now, like a mute and implacable witness to secrets that still refused to come to light. In Chapter 3, Contradictions in the Morning Light. The next morning brought with it an overcast sky and damp air, seeping through every crevice of Wrexham Hall. Poirot, impeccably dressed as always, descended to the dining-room shortly after 8, where he found Lady Margaret alone, sipping her tea with absent-minded movements. "Good morning, madame," Poirot greeted with a slight bow. She gave a tired smile. "I don't know how you can maintain such composure, Monsieur Poirot. This house seems to have a life of its own, and not exactly a kind life." Poirot took a seat opposite her, pouring himself a cup of coffee with almost choreographic precision. "When tragedy knocks at the door, madame, it is not the time to lose your balance. It's time to sharpen your senses, Ozir. Soon as he finished his breakfast, Poirot set off, determined to examine the key locations before the private interviews he had requested. He started in the North Gallery, the corridor where, in the photograph, the door appeared open. The long hallway was lined with dark portraits and faded tapestries. The oak door, now closed, creaked slightly as Poirot pushed it open. Beyond, a narrow hallway led directly to the library, where Lord Wrexham was found dead. Poirot bent down to examine the floor. The mud from the night before had left scattered trails. There were footprints, but already contaminated by the comings and goings of the servants and the police. However, one minor detail caught his attention: a small jagged indentation on the bottom edge of the door. Poirot brushed the indentation with his gloved finger, and his eyes narrowed slightly. A forced instrument, perhaps, he whispered. He continued towards the library. The room smelled of old leather and humidity. The shelves were packed with books, and in the centre, under a large lancet window, was Lord Wrexham's desk. The lock had been forced. The signal was faint but unmistakable. Inspector Catamol had assumed that this was post-death manipulation, but Poirot was not so willing to grant this. In front of the desk, the large high-backed chair seemed to have been moved slightly to one side. Poirot examined the rug under his paws. A deeper mark indicated where it had originally been placed. "Moved after the incident," he murmured, "because there were no documents visible on the desk, except for a book of poetry open to a page titled Doors and Thresholds." Poirot raised an eyebrow. When he returned to the main hall, the first suspect was already waiting for him. "Edward Wrexham. Thank you for coming, monsieur," Poirot said kindly, motioning for him to take a seat. Edward obeyed, although with visible discomfort. "Monsieur Edward," Poirot began, "you spoke yesterday of your presence in the greenhouse. Do you remember if anyone else passed by the North Gallery during that time?" Edward hesitated. "No, not that I've seen. Although, with the storm, it was difficult to hear anything. And your relationship with your father, was it cordial?" Edward pursed his lips before answering. "Respectful, although we disagreed on certain issues. Financial matters." A spark of irritation crossed Edward's eyes. He did not accept that the world had changed, that his methods, his way of managing the property, were obsolete. Poirot nodded slowly. A clash of generations, c'est naturel. But he mentally noted the irritation contained in the man's responses. Next to be interviewed was Clarissa Wrexham, radiant as an ice sculpture. "Madame Clarissa," Poirot began, "you confirmed your husband's alibi yesterday. Can you detail how you did it?" Clarissa raised a perfect eyebrow. "He was in the greenhouse with me. We looked at the damage. We don't separate." Poirot inclined his head slightly. Wasn't there a single moment when Monsieur Edward was absent? A barely perceptible pause preceded his response. "Maybe. A minute or two. He needed to look for some tools." "And you didn't accompany him?" "No, it wasn't necessary." Poirot smiled, slightly, as if that were exactly what he expected to hear. Henry was the third to parade before the little grey cells. "Monsieur Henry," Would you mind explaining your presence in the cellar?" Henry, with a carefree gesture, said, "What do you want me to tell you? The storm, the wine, and me. A logical combination." Poirot did not smile. "Did you find anything out of place?" Henry frowned. "No, although I heard a crash, like something heavy fell on the gallery. I thought it was the storm." Poirot straightened, his posture slightly. "Do you remember the time?" Henry shrugged. "Maybe 9, more or less." One more detail, another thread in the fabric of mystery. When Beatrice Vane walked in, her nervousness was palpable. "Miss Beatrice," said Poirot softly, "why did you choose the literature section that night?" "I was looking for a book to distract myself. I couldn't stand the tension in the house. Did you see anything out of the ordinary?" She hesitated, then quickly shook her head. Too fast, Poirot thought. Finally, in the morning gloom, Reverend Pritchard and Miss Brooks offered brief and seemingly innocuous accounts of their night. But Poirot knew that in these types of crimes, the truth was rarely in the words. It was in the omissions, in the silences, in the small averted glances. When he finished, Poirot retired to the drawing-room, where he looked at the family photograph again. The door open, the shadow, the faces, everything spoke. I just had to listen, and a more disturbing question was already beginning to emerge in his mind. Was it the first crime, or would there be another yet to occur? Chapter 4. A Shadow in the Chapel. The private chapel at Wrexham Hall was built of grey stone, at the end of a narrow hallway dimly lit by wall lamps. It had dark wooden pews, dust-covered stained glass windows, and a simple altar with a wrought iron. Crucifix Poirot had asked to examine it alone, and the butler, obedient but confused, handed him the key without asking questions. The detective crossed the threshold with a measured step, his cane tapping lightly on the stone floor. The air inside was thick, as if it trapped sighs and secrets. In front of the altar, a candle had been burned down to the base, as if someone had lit it the night before and forgotten to put it out. Poirot frowned. Curious. He walked slowly down the centre aisle, passing the benches one by one, observing the markings on the floor. One of the benches on the right side had a fresh nick. Someone had scraped its base while moving it. He leaned down to examine the wood. An impatient knee, perhaps, or a not-so-devout meeting. In the confessional, he found a crumpled, forgotten handkerchief, white, without visible mark, but with a slight floral fragrance. It wasn't a man's. Poirot did not touch it. He observed his position, as if he could deduce from the exact fold the emotional state of the person who left him behind. Retracing his steps, he stopped next to the last bench on the left side. There, under the bench, someone had clumsily recorded a small figure, an open door, very primitive, but indisputable. A macabre game? A sign? Whisper. He was silent for a moment, and then, in a low voice, with their fingers intertwined, an open door. In the photograph. An open door. Here too. When he returned to the house, Poirot requested a private conversation with Lady Margaret. He found her in the greenhouse, pruning roses with almost surgical delicacy. "Madam," he said softly, "did your husband visit the chapel frequently?" She nodded without looking up. "He was devout, yes. In his later years, More than before? Confessions? Do you talk to the Reverend? I couldn't say. My husband was not the type to easily share what was bothering him. Poirot bowed his head. Not even with you? Lady Margaret put the scissors aside. There was a voluntary distance. I accepted it. After so many years of marriage, one is resigned to certain silences. Poirot noticed a thorn stuck in his glove. Sometimes, madame, silences hide more than 1,000 words could reveal. That afternoon, Poirot requested a second conversation with the Reverend Pritchard, this time in his small office, a room with the smell of old paper and humidity. The cleric received him with a trembling voice. "Have you found anything in the chapel, Monsieur Poirot?" "I have found many things, mon ami. Some visible, others not so much. Tell me, were you really alone on the night of Lord Wrexham's death?" The Reverend swallowed. "Yeah, I prayed, like I said, and someone else came in. Did you hear any noise? Steps?" "No, I was focused." Poirot looked at his hands. They kept shaking. But this time it wasn't because of age. It was because of fear. "Reverend, if someone approached you seeking guidance, would you give them shelter?" The man looked at him, suddenly pale. "That depends on the situation. Even if that someone feared for their life, or had made a mistake. Monsieur Poirot," he exclaimed erect, "I am a man of faith, not an accomplice." Poirot raised a hand, calming the tension. "No one accuses you, mon père. But those who keep secrets sometimes do so for the wrong reasons, or too noble ones." The Reverend looked down. "I am not strong, Mr. Poirot. I never have been. I cling to the rituals, because the truth surpasses me." Poirot left him with a grave look, without judgment, but also without suspicion. That night, a storm even fiercer than the previous one hit Wrexham Hall. The windows vibrated, and the wind howled through the corridors. The house seemed to creak under the weight of something ancient. In his room, Poirot meditated in silence, surrounded by papers and notes. On the table he had the enlarged photograph, the door open, the shadow, and something else that I was only now beginning to seriously consider, the positions of the faces. He took a ruler, measured angles, wrote down names. Every look said something. Some looked at the camera. Others don't. Some seemed to stare right behind the photographer, and one seemed to be looking directly at the door. Poirot rose. He crossed the room to his suitcase and pulled out a small box with stamps, tape measures, and a special magnifying glass. He placed the photograph under a strong lamp, and there, barely noticeable, he saw something else. A silhouette. Diffuse, but human. Voila, he whispered. Not just a door, not just a shadow. Someone was photographed without knowing it. Later, Poirot received a note under his door. Modest paper, no signature. Just 5 words. "Don't look at the photograph, it burns." Poirot held the paper between his fingers. He smiled barely. "Too late, mon ami. He has already spoken," and while the wind outside beat like a lamentation, Poirot looked at the image again. He no longer saw her as a piece of evidence. I saw it as a warning. Chapter 5. The Empty Confessional. The night storm had left behind a leaden dawn, as if nature itself lamented some as yet unnamed crime. Poirot, now awake and dressed with his usual neatness, descended to the dining room, where Lady Margaret and Edward Wrexham were having breakfast in a charged silence. A local newspaper lay, barely leafed through, next to the teapot. Anodyne headlines, no mention of the drama still brewing within the walls of Wrexham Hall. But Poirot knew that soon they would not be able to hide it. After a brief courtesy, he discreetly headed towards the private chapel. Something about last night's anonymous warning had disturbed him more than he was willing to admit. He pushed open the door of the chapel, finding it ajar. A bad omen. Inside, the weak morning light filtered through the stained glass windows gave the place the air of an abandoned mausoleum. He advanced towards the confessional where he had found the handkerchief the day before. This time, the door was slightly ajar, like a silent invitation. Poirot pushed her. The interior was dark, the seat empty. But a closer look revealed something new. On the interior shelf, where religious objects were traditionally placed, was a folded sheet of paper. Poirot picked it up with extreme delicacy. It was a fragment torn from a common notebook, written with a hasty stroke. "I'm sorry. It wasn't intentional. It shouldn't have happened. But I can't confess it. There was no signature. There were no names. Just the palpable desperation in every lyric upon Poirot reflected for a few moments, in complete silence, listening to the echo of his own breathing in the empty room. Then he folded the paper carefully and put it in his inside pocket. A soul in conflict, but of guilt or complicity, he murmured. On leaving the chapel, Poirot happened to pass Miss Helena Brooks, the governess. She was carrying books, but when she saw the detective, she paled visibly. A single second of lack of control. Poirot, always attentive to nuances, did not miss the detail. "Mademoiselle," he said politely, "are you well this morning?" Miss Brooks clutched the books against her chest defensively. "Perfectly, Monsieur Poirot. I was just heading to the library." "Ah, the library," Poirot repeated with a subtle gleam in his eyes. "Place of knowledge, and sometimes of concealments." She didn't respond and quickened her pace. Poirot watched her disappear into the corridor, her figure rigid as a stake against the stone floor. One fears being discovered. Only if one has something to hide, he reflected in a low voice. Later that morning, Poirot summoned Henry Wrexham to the green drawing-room. The young bohemian arrived with his usual air of insolence. Although beneath his insouciance, Poirot perceived an increase in his nervousness. "Monsieur Henry," Poirot began kindly, "last night I received a very curious note. Someone, it seems, fears what may be discovered in a photograph." Henry frowned, bewildered. "Note? What photograph?" Poirot watched their reactions. Sincere in his bewilderment, perhaps, but sincerity, Poirot knew, could be as deceptive as lies. "Your father's birthday photograph," Poirot explained. "An innocent image, apparently. But now suspicious." Henry leaned back in his chair. "I don't see how a photo can solve anything." Poirot intertwined his fingers. "Ah, monsieur, images capture not only appearance, but sometimes guilt." Henry gave a short, almost forced laugh. "Blame? What are you accusing me of?" "I do not accuse, monsieur. I just observe." The young man stood up abruptly. "I won't tolerate insinuations. If you need me for something real," and without waiting for a response, he left the room. Poirot, unmoved, watched the door close. Every reaction, every rushed word, was another small crack in the carefully constructed facade of the inhabitants of Wrexham Hall. That afternoon, Poirot asked to meet Beatrice Vane in the gardens. The young niece seemed even more nervous than before. "Mademoiselle Beatrice," said Poirot gently, "I have noticed that something is deeply disturbing you. Do you trust me to help you?" Beatrice hesitated, biting her lower lip. He started but stopped. Poirot waited patiently, allowing him to find his way. Finally, Beatrice lowered her voice to a whisper. "I don't know if what I saw is important. Everything is important, mademoiselle, especially what we consider trivial." She took a deep breath. "The night Lord Wrexham died, I saw someone in the North Gallery. But I couldn't make out who it was, just a silhouette, gliding in the darkness." "What time?" "About 9. The same approximate time of the knock that Henry had mentioned hearing in the cellar." Poirot bowed his head. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have done well to trust me." As Beatrice nervously returned to the house, Poirot reflected on what he had gathered. A silhouette in the gallery, a shadow in the photograph, a half-hearted confession in the chapel, a warning to destroy evidence. Each piece fit into a still incomplete pattern. And Poirot knew that there would soon be one more move, a desperate manoeuvre by the culprit before the net closed. Chapter 6. The Second Strike. The wind had died down that night, but in Wrexham Hall there was a tension thicker than any storm. The hallways were silent, barely broken by the distant echoes of muffled footsteps or the creak of antique furniture. Poirot, sitting in a small adjoining room, was reviewing the enlarged photograph for the umpteenth time under the light of a desk lamp. The shadow at the door, the angle of the looks, the silhouette barely visible. Too many elements pointed to the fact that the crime had not been the result of chance. Outside, the night was a closed blanket, and Poirot, sensing the unmistakable scent of imminence, remained alert. No more than 20 minutes passed before a scream shattered the calm. Poirot rose immediately, leaving the photograph on the table. He crossed the hallway with short but determined steps. Other members of the house emerged from their rooms, dishevelled and terrified. The scream had come from the east wing. Lady Margaret was the first to articulate it. "The North Gallery!" Without waiting any longer, Poirot stepped forward, followed by Edward and Henry. The corridor leading to the gallery was plunged into irregular darkness. Only an oil lamp trembled at the end of the hall. On the floor in front of the library door lay Beatrice Vane. He was conscious, but he was gasping and sobbing, pointing ahead with trembling fingers. Poirot leaned over her protectively. "Mademoiselle, calme-toi. You are safe now. What has happened?" Beatrice, with great effort, managed to speak. "I saw someone, a figure. I wanted to follow her, but I stumbled." Poirot looked down the hallway. There were no signs of the intruder. Henry murmured, his voice heavy with bad humour, "Damn house! Every corner seems to breathe deception." Poirot helped Lady Margaret and Clarissa lift Beatrice and escort her to her room. Then the detective stood back, staring down the empty hallway. His eyes stopped on a tiny but telling detail. a piece of dark fabric caught in a splinter of the door. With tweezers, he picked it up. He kept it with great care. That morning, he called a private meeting in the music room. The atmosphere was tense, pale faces, averted glances. Poirot stood by the grand piano, small and erect as a sentinel. "Mes amis," he said gravely, "this is no longer a simple investigation. Last night someone tried to prevent the truth once again." Henry, leaning back in an armchair, laughed bitterly. "True, we all have our own truths here, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot cocked his head. "Maybe, but the truth of the facts, that does not change, no matter how much we try to bend it." Edward ran a hand through his hair, visibly agitated. "Are you suggesting that someone among us attacked Beatrice?" "I do not suggest, monsieur. I confirm." He turned to Lady Margaret. "Madam, are there entrances to the North Gallery that are not known to everyone?" Lady Margaret thought for a moment. An old passage behind the library. It was sealed years ago, but it could be forced. Poirot nodded, as if that confirmed an already formed suspicion. "We'll examine it tomorrow," he announced. "But now, I need everyone to stay in the house. Nobody should leave. No one should act without my knowledge." His tone was courteous, but ironclad. No one protested. Poirot, satisfied, concluded, "And I warn you, mes amis, the truth cannot be hidden forever. Like the shadow in a photograph, it ends up emerging, even if we don't want to see it." Later, as Wrexham Hall fell into a tense sleep, Poirot returned to his room. On his bedside table, he had left the piece of cloth recovered in the hallway. In the light of the lamp, he could see its texture. Dark, fine velvet of excellent quality. Thoughtfully, he remembered the clothes of those present. Only one, Poirot, remembered wore a velvet jacket that night, Clarissa Wrexham. He didn't say anything out loud. Not yet. Poirot knew that impulses were dangerous. Circumstantial evidence was not enough for an accusation, and Clarissa, with her perfect smile and icy composure, was not a woman who made mistakes easily. The evidence had to accumulate. I had to wait for the right moment. Poirot closed the box with the fragment of cloth and extinguished the lamp. And the wind resumed its lament against the glass. His thoughts swirled. A forgotten passageway, a lying photograph, a note of warning, a shadowy figure. The culprit, he realized, was no longer attacking out of desperation. He was attacking for strategy, and soon he would make a fatal mistake. Chapter 7. The Passage and the Half-Truth. The next day dawned with a leaden sky and a dense mist that seemed to float between the trees of the park. Wrexham Hall, of grey stone and stern towers, stood like a watchful figure in the dull light. Poirot, after a brief breakfast, requested that the butler guide him to the supposed passageway mentioned by Lady Margaret. The butler, a wiry man named Foster, led Poirot to the library. There, on the east wall, behind a row of fixed shelves, there was a panel that was barely different from the surrounding panelling. "Hardly anyone remembers this, sir," Foster said, caressing the hidden edge with his worn fingers. "It was sealed when the third Viscount died accidentally in the North Gallery. A curse, they said." Poirot raised his eyebrows. Superstitions, Monsieur Foster, are the favourite veil of logic, when we do not want to see the obvious. The panel, although worn by time, gave way after a few minutes of struggling with a lever. Behind it, a narrow corridor opened, dimly lit by vents strategically placed in the stone. The detective advanced slowly, his footsteps echoing dully. The tunnel smelled of damp and old dust. Halfway there, he stopped. There, on the compacted dirt floor, were fresh footprints, light but visible. A person had used that passage, and not long ago. Poirot smiled to himself. It was not superstition that haunted Wrexham Hall. It was calculus. Back in the drawing-room, Poirot requested the presence of Clarissa Wrexham. The heir's wife appeared, as impeccable as ever, her dark blue dress tailored to perfection, her haughty bearing unchanged. "Madame Clarissa," Poirot began politely, "something unfortunate happened last night, a new attempt to silence a witness." Clarissa tilted her head slightly. "Are you implying that I have something to do with it?" "I'm not implying anything, madam. I'm just looking to understand the facts." He took a few steps closer, lowering his voice slightly. A piece of velvet was found at the scene, a fabric that curiously matches his jacket. She held his gaze without blinking. "Fashion is not evidence, Monsieur Poirot, and many here wear velvet." Poirot gave a small smile. "Of course, it wouldn't be my style to rush." But Clarissa had already revealed a subtle discomfort, a slight hardening of her jaw. Poirot did not press her further. He knew that the real culprits rarely broke down in the face of direct confrontation. It was in the small moments, in the cracks in his facade, where they manifested themselves. After Clarissa, Poirot asked to speak briefly with Beatrice. The young woman, still pale from the scare of the previous night, agreed to meet in the tea-room. "Mademoiselle Beatrice," said Poirot kindly, "you mentioned seeing a figure in the gallery. Could you tell me if you noticed anything particular? About his walk, his size, his clothes?" Beatrice frowned, remembering. She was tall, and she was wearing something dark, but he moved fast, as if he knew the terrain well. "Did you recognize any more details?" She shook her head sadly. "It was all very fast, and there was so much fear in me." Poirot nodded understandingly. "Fear clouds the senses, mademoiselle, but sometimes, in the details that we do not believe are important, the truth lies." He thanked her for her sincerity and let her go, deep in thought. Later, as he crossed the corridors toward the north wing, Poirot saw Edward Wrexham discreetly, arguing with Henry. They both fell silent when they noticed his presence. Poirot bowed to them and continued on his way. But that scene did not go unnoticed. There was a growing, barely concealed tension between the two brothers, a disagreement over money, or for something more immediate and darker. The crime, Poirot thought, was not just an act. It was the culmination of a series of decisions, of simmering resentments, of secrets carefully kept until they could no longer be held, and Wrexham Hall was a hotbed of such resentments. That night, Poirot worked late in his room. On his desk he had several objects arranged in meticulous order: the enlarged photograph, the velvet fragment, the anonymous note that said, "Don't look at the photograph. It burns." The handkerchief found in the confessional. Each one was a silenced voice that, together, formed a choir. You just had to know how to listen to it. As he noted patterns and reconstructed chronologies, Poirot felt that the pieces of the puzzle were finally beginning to fit together. It wasn't just a crime of opportunity. There was precise planning behind it, and a mistake, the most human of mistakes. Poirot paused, looking at the photograph once more. The shadow at the door, the face that did not look at the camera, the rigidity of certain postures, small inconsistencies, little truths. Tomorrow, he decided, he would confront everyone. But not yet to accuse. No, first I would show them the mirror. And then, when the disguises fell, the culprit would reveal himself. Chapter 8. The Mirror of Contradictions. The next morning dawned even greyer, as if nature itself sensed that something crucial was about to happen. In the great hall of Wrexham Hall, portraits of the ancestors seemed to regard the living with mute severity, as Poirot meticulously arranged the scene. He had asked that all the inhabitants of the house gather together. Lady Margaret, Edward and Clarissa Wrexham, Henry, Beatrice, the Reverend Pritchard and Miss Helena Brooks were summoned. Inspector Cattermole, although frustrated by his merely observing role, was also present, with his arms crossed and a sullen expression. When everyone was seated, Poirot stood in the centre of the room, small but imposing, like a general before his army. On a small table carefully visible lay the enlarged photograph. "Mes amis," he began, "I have brought you together today not to point fingers, yet," he added, letting his words hang in the air, "but to show you a mirror that reflects not the faces but the movements, the gestures, the small contradictions that all of you have committed since the night of the tragedy." Some exchanged awkward glances. Others, like Clarissa, remained unfazed. Poirot walked slowly towards the photograph. "In this portrait," he said, "we see the whole Wrexham family together, an image of apparent harmony. But like everything at Wrexham Hall, the facade hides murkier realities." He pointed to the open door at the back. "This door should have been closed. However, it appears ajar, not by chance." He turned to the group. "Who opened that door? Who needed to create an escape route or a distraction?" Silence. Poirot let the tension build for a few more seconds, before continuing. "When I analysed this image with a magnifying glass, I observed not only the door, but also the looks. Most of you look at the photographer, as expected. But one doesn't." He approached the photograph, discreetly indicating a figure on the far right, the Reverend Pritchard. He said softly. His eyes are not directed at the camera, but at the background. At the door, a murmur ran through the room. The Reverend stiffened. "Do not judge me yet, mes amis," continued Poirot calmly. "There is more. The chapel confessional, the forgotten passage, the anonymous note, all small threads of the same fabric." Lady Margaret, with her characteristic temper, asked, "Are you suggesting that the Reverend was the murderer?" Poirot shook his head. "No, madam. What I'm suggesting is that the Reverend saw something I shouldn't have seen, and that, moved by guilt or fear, he has tried to protect." The Reverend lowered his head, sweaty, unable to meet the other's gaze. Poirot took a few steps towards Henry. "Monsieur Henry, you mentioned hearing a knock in the cellar, around 9, correct?" "Yes." the young man responded, uncomfortable. And Mademoiselle Beatrice saw a silhouette moving in the gallery at that same time. Poirot let everyone slowly tie the threads. "What does this mean?" Edward asked, his voice thick with impatience. Poirot smiled faintly. "It means that Lord Wrexham's death was not an isolated accident. It means someone used the storm as a screen, that quick and discreet access was planned, and that, when things got complicated, fear led to making new mistakes." He then turned to Clarissa, whose finely made-up lips were now stretched into a thin line. "Madame Clarissa," said Poirot in a neutral tone, "your velvet jacket, when did you have it repaired?" She raised an Chieuhart's eyebrow, but it was a moment too slow. "I don't remember," he said coldly. "Curious," said Poirot, "because a fragment of dark velvet cloth was found on the night that Mademoiselle Beatrice was attacked, and it matches your garment perfectly." Clarissa crossed her arms, her mask still intact, though now cracked. Poirot did not press her further. He took a step back, taking everyone in with a slow look. "This house," he said in a low voice, "is like a spider's web. They are all tangled, lies, half-truths, omissions." He looked at the photograph once more. "Tomorrow," he finally announced, "I will gather all of you together once more, and then the full truth will emerge." With a small bow of his head, Poirot took his leave. He left behind a silent room, charged with almost unbearable tension. He knew that tonight someone would try one last desperate move. Fear, after all, was the best revealer of guilt. Chapter 9. The Last Move. That night, the atmosphere at Wrexham Hall was almost unbreathable. The echo of Poirot's words still resonated in every corner. "Tomorrow, the truth will emerge." Most of the inhabitants of the house had retired early to their rooms, but Poirot, who rarely gave in to sleep when he smelled fear in the air, remained awake. From his window he could see the gardens bathed in a thick fog, where the statues looked like ghosts lurking among the hedges. At 2 in the morning, a subtle noise broke the stillness, a creak in the hallway. Poirot, silently putting on his shoes, crept to the door of his room and opened it just a crack. He saw a hooded figure stealthily moving in the direction of the library. Without making a sound, Poirot followed them, keeping to the shadows. The figure carried a covered lantern, casting a small halo of yellowish light. Poirot watched as the intruder manipulated the secret panel of the bookshelf, activating the passageway mechanism. A few moments later, he disappeared into the darkness of the hidden corridor. Poirot smiled slightly. Desperation always led to the clumsiest steps. Without wasting time, he descended a secondary staircase, and with calculated precision, intercepted the exit from the passage in the northern gallery. He waited in the darkness, patient as a hunter. 5 minutes later the figure emerged, panting slightly with the effort. Poirot turned on the lamp in his pocket, illuminating the dazed face of the man, Clarissa Wrexham. For a moment they both looked at each other, frozen in a heavy silence. Clarissa regained her composure with admirable speed. "Monsieur Poirot," he said in an icy tone, "what does this melodramatic scene mean?" Poirot tilted his head politely. "Madame, it simply means that tonight You intended to eliminate the last evidence of your guilt. She held his gaze, but her lips trembled barely. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, madame. Poirot sighed theatrically. The photography, your presence tonight in the hallway, only confirms what I already suspected, that you were seeking to eliminate her. Poirot was silent for a few seconds, giving him the opportunity to speak, but Clarissa only raised her chin in defiance. Finally Poirot added, "Tomorrow, madame. Before everyone. Don't run away. Don't lie any more. Because now, even the ghosts in this house know the truth." With an elegant gesture, he showed her the way back. Clarissa, defeated but still haughty, crossed the hallway without saying a word. At dawn, Poirot took a short walk through the gardens. Dew covered the grass, and the diffuse light of dawn began to outline the contours of the sleeping statues. As he walked, he mentally reviewed the latest moves on the board, the velvet fragment, the use of the passageway, the warning to destroy, though, photograph Clarissa's reaction to each new piece of evidence. Everything pointed to the same origin. And yet, Poirot, ever the perfectionist, knew that he had to connect all the dots. The initial crime, the death of Lord Wrexham, had been presented as natural, but too many details contradicted it. The open window, the forced lock, the half-open door in the photograph, the shadow. It was a crime of opportunity, yes, but executed coldly. And there was something else, an ulterior motive, a motive that had not yet been fully revealed, but that he sensed was around money, and something even more personal. When he returned inside the house, Poirot found Inspector Catamole waiting for him by the drawing-room. "Are you ready for this big reveal of yours, Poirot?" he asked sceptically. Poirot smiled impeccably. "Ready, mon cher. Although, as always, logic will speak, not me." At 11 in the morning, all the inhabitants of Wrexham Hall were gathered again in the hall, exactly as Poirot had arranged. The atmosphere was so dense that it seemed that a poorly placed word could make it explode. Poirot, standing in front of everyone, took a moment to observe them. Lady Margaret, upright but emaciated. Edward, tense as a spring. Henry, restless, drumming his fingers. Beatrice, pale, expectant. Reverend Pritchard, crestfallen. Miss Brooks, rigid as a statue. And Clarissa, calm in appearance, but with a gaze as icy as a sharp blade. Poirot inhaled deeply. "Mes amis," he said, "the time of shadows is over." He approached the photograph on the table. This image, seemingly innocent, captured not only forced smiles, but the germ of a murder. And if you will allow me, today I will unravel before you what really happened that night. A dull murmur ran through the room. Hearts were pounding. The tension was a thread about to break. Poirot smiled briefly. But as always, we will start with the small grey cells. And so, with all eyes fixed on him, Hercule Poirot took the first step towards the inevitable outcome. Chapter 10. Poirot's Method. Poirot, standing before everyone gathered in the great hall of Wrexham Hall, slowly clasped his hands together, as if savouring the moment before unfurling his inevitable net. "To understand the crime committed in this house," he began, "we must not look only at the final act, but at the chain of small details." His eyes travelled over each face. Some, like Lady Margaret, listened with suppressed anguish. Others, like Henry, swayed nervously in their seats. First, the open door in the photograph, not an oversight, but a warning. A deliberate mark to create an escape route or signal complicity. Second, the library window open during a storm. A clumsiness or a manoeuvre to confuse the scene of death. Poirot paused briefly, allowing the ideas to germinate in his listeners. Third, the forced lock on Lord Wrexham's desk. And fourth, the disappearance of certain important documents that, coincidentally, have not yet been recovered. Inspector Catamol coughed uncomfortably, but Poirot did not spare him a glance. These elements, mes amis, are not isolated incidents. They are pieces of precise machinery. And at the heart of that machinery, we find the mobile phone. Edward Wrexham leaned forward, unable to contain himself. And what would that motive be, Monsieur Poirot? Poirot allowed himself a small smile. Survival, or rather, the preservation of status, money, social image. Poirot took a couple of steps and picked up the fragment of velvet found on the night of the second attack. When Mademoiselle Beatrice was attacked, there was no attempt to silence her for having seen a face. No, she only saw a silhouette. Instead, it was intended to instill terror, divert suspicion, and create confusion. He turned to Clarissa. "And you, madam, were found last night trying to access the secret passage again." Clarissa, impeccable as a sphinx, held his gaze without blinking. "And what do you intend to deduce from that?" Poirot tilted his head politely. That there was something he wanted to recover or destroy, something to do with the night of Lord Wrexham's death. The silence that followed was thick as lead. Poirot let the tension build a moment longer before continuing. "But it would be a mistake, mes amis, to assume that everything revolves around a single culprit. No, no, no!" He made a delicate gesture with his hand. "What we have here is a silent complicity, a chain of small betrayals. Some acted out of fear, others out of greed, and others out of misguided loyalty." He glanced briefly at Reverend Pritchard, who was sweating profusely. "Some saw and were silent," said Poirot in a low voice. "Others manipulated, others executed." Then Margaret gripped the edge of her chair so hard that her knuckles turned white. Poirot turned to her. "Madame, you knew that your husband had been making risky financial decisions, that he had endangered the family assets." Lady Margaret nodded, shakily. "Yes, but I didn't think—" "He thought he could handle it," Poirot interrupted softly. "But desperation is a bad adviser." Poirot walked up to the photograph again, pointing at the figure of Lord Wrexham, so proud, so unaware of the fate that awaited him. On the night of the crime, Lord Wrexham was confronted. An argument ensued. Truths were discovered that could not come to light without scandal. He turned, facing Edward and Clarissa directly. And then a decision was made. Not impulsive, calculated. Edward jumped to his feet. "That's absurd!" Shout. "There are no tests, Poirot." Did not flinch. "No, monsieur. The torn fabric, the passage manipulation of the scene, the omissions in their statements." He calmly clasped his hands again. "But I'm not done yet." He let his words float in the air, like a shadow slowly lengthening. Then he added, "Because the most revealing thing is not what they did on the night of the crime, but what they have done since then. The rush to destroy evidence, the attack on a witness, the attempt to manipulate the interviews." Poirot smiled briefly. "All that, mes amis, speaks louder than any alibi." Henry, until now silent, leaned forward, his voice filled with a mix of fury and fascination. "And then, Poirot, who was it?" Poirot raised an elegant finger. "Patience, monsieur. Tomorrow," he said with a half-smile, "tomorrow morning I will bring you together one last time, and then there will be no room for doubt." He said goodbye with a slight bow. The faces before him were tense, anticipating the imminent fall of the mask. Wrexham Hall, in the grey light of a new dawn, would await the inevitable verdict. Chapter 11. The Final Meeting. The grandfather clock in the drawing-room of Wrexham Hall read 11 in the morning when everyone was called again. The atmosphere was different this time. Heavier, denser, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Lady Margaret, sitting upright like a marble statue, seemed to have aged a decade in one night. Edward and Clarissa, shoulder to shoulder but emotionally distant, maintained a forced air of composure. Henry, restless, couldn't stop moving his foot. Beatrice, with her hands clenched in her lap, barely dared to look up. Reverend Pritchard and Miss Brooks completed the circle, rigid, like figures on an imminent stage. Poirot looked at them all before taking his place in the centre of the room. "Mes amis," he began in a calm voice, "I promised you that today everything would be clear, and so it will be." He took the family photograph, now placed on an easel, and slowly turned it toward the group. "This image contains the keys to everything that has happened at Wrexham Hall, because photographs, mes amis, capture not only what we wish to show, but also what we inadvertently reveal." He pointed to the half-open door in the background of the image. A door that should have been closed. But that, however, was left open on purpose. So that, to allow discreet access. A passageway to the library. Poirot walked slowly in front of them, his steps short and measured. When Lord Wrexham was found dead, the circumstances suggested a heart attack. However, the open window, the forced lock, the moved chair, all small details that indicated manipulation. He stopped in front of Edward. "Monsieur Edward, you had everything to gain from your father's death. The hidden debts, the risk of losing property. All this would have come to light if Lord Wrexham had lived a few months longer." Edward paled, but did not respond. Poirot turned to Clarissa. "And you, Madame Clarissa, with your cold sense of expediency, were the ones who conceived the plan to avoid the scandal. A plan that depended on making it appear that Lord Wrexham had died of natural causes, while certain compromising documents disappeared forever." Clarissa stood still, her face perfectly carved from ice. Poirot continued, his voice firm. "That night, as the storm raged, Edward distracted the others in the greenhouse. Clarissa, using the secret passage, entered the library. There, he forced open the desk, removed the documents, and then, in an unexpected confrontation, Lord Wrexham was attacked. A murmur of horror ran through the room. Poirot raised a hand. "The death may not have been planned exactly like that. Maybe a struggle, a push, a fatal fall. But the truth is that once it happened, it was covered up. The window opened to simulate an accidental death. The displaced chair. The door in the photograph as an involuntary witness to the conspiracy." Then turned to Henry. "Monsieur Henry, you heard a knock, didn't you?" Henry nodded, stunned. That was the moment Lord Wrexham fell. Poirot let his words sink into the minds of those present. But the plan began to fall apart when the photograph revealed the open door. When Beatrice saw a figure in the gallery, when Reverend Pritchard, that night in the chapel, heard a half-confession that he dared not repeat. The Reverend covered his face with his hands. Poirot took a deep breath, preparing to conclude. "And so, Madame Clarissa," he said, his voice soft but implacable, "he then attempted to eliminate the evidence. The piece of velvet found, the attempt to intimidate Beatrice, the sneaky access to the passage last night, all to protect not only yourself, but your husband." Clarissa finally spoke. His voice was a sharp whisper. "And if it was like that, do you think, Monsieur Poirot, that anyone here will truly mourn your death? Lord Wrexham had condemned this family. We just survived." An icy silence descended upon the room. Poirot looked at her sadly. "Madame, I am not a judge. I'm just the one who reveals the facts. Justice will come of itself." He turned to Inspector Catamole. "Monsieur, I think you can now act according to the law." The inspector, with a grim face, advanced, but Poirot did not move yet. There was one last detail that needed to be revealed, one last twist that no one, not even Clarissa, suspected yet. And as the clock slowly struck the next hour, Poirot knew that the net was almost closed, but the absolute truth had yet to be spoken. Chapter 12. The Absolute Truth. When Clarissa Wrexham was escorted out of the room by Inspector Catamole, with his head held high and his silence as a shield, everyone believed that the case was solved. Everyone, except Hercule Poirot, the Belgian. Detective remained standing, impassive, with his fingers intertwined on his belly, and his gaze still alight with thought. "Mes amis," he said in a low but firm voice, "what we have witnessed is not the end, but the penultimate act." Faces, already exhausted, turned towards him in disbelief. Edward, in particular, paled. "What are you saying, Poirot?" "My wife has confessed." Poirot looked at him gently, but without hesitation. "No, monsieur. She sacrificed herself for you, and you allowed it." A chill ran through the room. Poirot began to walk slowly in front of them, his steps soft on the carpet, like a metronome marking the rhythm of truth. From the beginning, photography was key, not only because of the open door, but because of the angle of the glances. Everyone, except one person, looked at the camera. And you, Monsieur Edward, were looking to your right, towards the door. You knew someone would stop by, because you planned the moment yourself. Edward swallowed silently. Poirot continued. You knew that your father had changed his will, that he was thinking of selling part of the property, that at any moment everything he had built, all the inheritance he considered his right, would disappear. He turned to Lady Margaret. "Madame, Your husband told you about his intentions, but you, out of dignity or habit, did not intervene." She nodded slightly, tears trembling in her eyes. Poirot turned to Edward. "You took advantage of your birthday." He gathered everyone together for a photograph that, ironically, would give him away. He had the passage panel opened the night before, and when the storm came, when everyone was scattered, Clarissa acted as an accomplice, yes. But it was you who pushed your father during the argument. A blow, a fall, not planned perhaps, but not regretted either. "No!" Edward shouted, standing up, his voice breaking. "It wasn't like that. It wasn't as he says." Poirot looked at him with compassion. "Then explain to me why, last night, Clarissa tried to recover the copy of the will that you hid in the library. Because she found him after the crime. Because she knew, as she read it, that her husband had acted not just out of desperation, but out of pure greed. She shouldn't have known!" Edward shouted, his voice cracking into a defeated whisper. "He shouldn't have known that he was no longer the heir, that my father had secretly disinherited me, that he had left almost everything to Beatrice." Beatrice covered her mouth with both hands. Poirot nodded sadly. "And you, Mademoiselle Beatrice, did not know that?" "Because Lord Wrexham wanted to tell him himself. He wanted her to stay out of family conflicts." Beatrice burst into tears. Poirot, in a barely audible voice, finished. "Edward killed for fear of being left with nothing. Clarissa covered up for love, or pride. And the rest of you, out of ignorance, out of silence, out of blind trust, you allowed the truth to almost be lost." The inspector, his face hardened, advanced towards Edward. But the man did not resist. His gaze was that of a hollow man. "I would have lost everything," he murmured, "and I lost it anyway." Poirot watched as he was led away, his shoulders hunched with the weight of guilt. Only the echo remained in the room, the clock ticking the minutes, the creaking of old wood. Finally, Lady Margaret rose. "Monsieur Poirot," he said in a weak voice, "you have been fair. Although the truth has destroyed us, will you regret having said it?" Poirot looked at her with a mixture of solemnity and tenderness. "The truth, madam, always weighs, but it is the only weight that justice can sustain." That afternoon, while packing his luggage in the guest room, Poirot looked at the photograph one last time. I no longer saw an open door, not a shadow, not a threat. I saw an ignored warning, a symbol of how secrets, no matter how hard they try to lock them up, always find a way to sneak into the image. He kept the folded photo in his briefcase, not as proof, but as a memory. Before leaving, he crossed the gardens for the last time. Beatrice, sitting on a stone bench, looked up when she heard his footsteps. "Do you think I'll be able to forgive them one day?" he asked him. Poirot stopped beside her, and for a moment let the silence answer. "I don't know, mademoiselle," he said finally, "but I assure you that what you experienced will make you stronger than all of them combined." She nodded, not smiling, but with a different sparkle in her eyes. Poirot bowed slightly, turned, and walked towards the carriage that was waiting for him at the entrance. The mist rose slowly. The house remained. But the truth at last had crossed the threshold.